Hey, welcome to Chris for everything audio, video, and photography. Today, I want to show you how I edited one of my high contrast black and white fine art photos. I'm going to show you how I turned this into this. Let's jump into the computer and take a look at how it's done. Okay, so here we are in Photoshop. This is the final image, and this is what we started with. I'm working in Photoshop. You can do this in any program that lets you work in layers. You could probably find a way to do this in Lightroom. In fact, I could probably envision some of the steps to do this in Lightroom. I just prefer working in Photoshop. Let's turn off all these layers. This is our base layer. This is the layer that we're going to start with right here. And this is what that looked like. This is not exactly straight out of camera. So when I first bring an image in, I bring in a raw image and I'm greeted with the raw camera filter. Generally what I do is I'm going to drop the highlights, open the shadows, maybe play with exposure a little bit, typically add a little bit of clarity, and then I'll usually do a little bit of perspective correcting, but not a ton. In this case, I corrected the perspective on this nearest corner of the building, and I let the other two just continue to fall away as they will when you're looking up at a building like this. I like to use lighting that's a little surreal. I like to play around with uncorrected perspectives. I like the way the images look. This is just a personal taste, but this is where I start. So I've done a little bit of raw processing on this, not a ton, really basic adjustments, and I've brought it in here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a layer that I'll call clone and repair or something like that. And what this layer is doing is, in this instance, is I'm just taking out this light and camera. This is also the layer I'd correct any spots that are on my sensors or anything like that. But in this case, it's just removing that. Typically what I'll do to convert to black and white is I will duplicate this clone and repair layer, and I'll do a black and white conversion to it using a camera raw filter. So I'll come into camera raw filter. So in the camera raw filter, what we'll do is we'll just hit the straight black and white conversion. And that straight black and white conversion, if you're starting with a contrasty image, gives you, it's a pretty decent image. But I like to go over here into the black and white mixer and start playing with the tones and the individual colors that are underneath this black and white layer. So there's a lot of orange in this image. So I can grab the orange slider and I can make the building lighter and darker. I can grab the blue slider and I can darken and lighten the sky. There's some yellows in this image, and you can see those kind of getting darker and lighter. Every image is going to be a little bit different based on the colors that are already in the image, but this is how I like to do black and white conversions because I can really start dialing in some contrast in the image very specifically. Before we get into the clouds, I want to show you one other thing I do here at the beginning, somewhere between cloning and converting to black and white, is I'll make my selections. So as we're looking at this image, I want to make selections to affect different parts of the image. I want to adjust this left part separately from this little strip here, separate from the main face of the building here, separate from the right side and the sky. In some photos, I'll actually go through and individually select windows, but in this case, I've just got the main selections, and you can see those. If we go into select, load selection, you can see the different selections I made, right? Left 2 row was that small left side of the building, main wall, sky. So as we get into starting to work on the sky, what we're going to have to do is use the sky selection to make sure that the adjustments we make are just affecting the sky. So to do the cloud layer, I'm going to add a blank layer. I'm going to load my sky selection, and this will let me just work on the sky without affecting the building at all. Right? So now I've got the sky selected. You can see the marching ants. And I'm going to use a brush that I downloaded from, I think this one comes from the Phlearn website, Phlearn. But there's a lot of free brush plugins all over the internet. This one is from Phlearn. This, without getting really deep into setting up custom brushes, this brush is designed to rotate and change size every time I use it. I'm also working with a flow of about 65%. You can play with that and make your clouds thinner or thicker. But in this case, I'm just going to throw some clouds in here, right? And I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to make these perfect. But one of the things I want to show you here is with the selection, if I'm clicking over here, see how those clouds are just kind of behind the building, not on top of the building? If we turned off our selection and put a cloud over here, it's on top of the building, right? So we want to make sure that we are working with our selection. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time making these clouds perfect. This is something that I play with to get the look I want. But the next step here would be to go up into the filters, and I'm going to add a motion blur filter. And you can see here already what that's doing, right? It's streaking. Now I can control the amount of blur, and I control the angle of the blur to get what I'm looking for. And again, if I do this blur without the selection, it's going to take those clouds and drag them across our image. So you need to make sure that you have a nice selection so that this adjustment only affects the sky. Okay, so we're going to drop that off. You don't need this mask. I honestly can't remember why I dropped this mask in here, but you just need the selection to get this. I think maybe somewhere I did some additional editing to the sky, but I can't remember exactly what I did in this case. But you don't need this mask. So moving on here, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 adjustment layers that are all basically the same thing. And what they are their curves adjustments that I've then masked out and applied gradients to get the kind of light I want on the side of the building. So let's jump out here. I'm going to turn all these on real quick. So I've got a light to dark kind of fade on this part of the building, on this part of the building, on this part of the building. I got some extra light coming through here. I've got a little bit of light on the side here. That's all done with these layers right here, these 5 layers. So I'm going to show you how we do one of those real quick. I'm going to turn off our main selection. So we're going to create an adjustment layer, and we're going to create a curves adjustment layer. And that curves adjustment layer, when we create it, it comes with a mask. Now with masks, white reveals, black conceals. So with the mask white, any adjustment I make to the curve here is going to affect the whole image. So if I brighten this up, it's going to brighten the entire image, right? So what I want to do is I want to go back in here, make sure I've got this layer selected, and I'm going to hit Control I. And that is going to take away that adjustment, right? So now I've got this mask here and nothing's coming through. I'm going to take my gradient tool, and I'm using a light to dark gradient. The opacity is 100%, and in this case I'm working with a linear gradient. And I'm going to load a selection. Let's work on the main wall of the building. So now if I take my gradient tool on top of this selection and I grab and I drag, you can see I'm revealing that brighter curve layer underneath the mask, but I'm only revealing it as a gradient from light to dark, where I made that gradient selection on top of the main side of the building here. Now let's back that out real quick, and let's turn off the selection. Now if I use that gradient tool without that selected, it affects the entire photo, right? We can go down here by the layers, and we can actually see on the mask how the entire photo goes light to dark. Okay, so let's undo that one more time. Let's reload our selection. So we've got the main part of the building selected. I'm going to drag that adjustment in again. Let's go look at our layer here real quick. And you can see now I'm not affecting the whole photo. I'm just inside that selection. That is essentially how all 5 of these layers work. They're all just curves adjustments with masks that have had gradients applied. Typically, for me, either linear gradients, reflected gradients, or circular gradients, round gradients. So I'm going to delete that layer. So I've got the building looking the way I like it. Right? I like the light I have here, but there's not a lot of contrast between the building and the sky, right? You just saw my layer flash when I zoomed in there, but there's not a lot of contrast. There's a lot of gray here. So I want to make an adjustment to the sky. You can see that the sky is masked out here. So to get this mask on my exposure adjustment layer for the sky, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here and I'm going to load my sky selection. Okay, so now you can see I've got the marching ants around the sky. So the sky, with the sky selected, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to open an exposure adjustment layer. And you see how I just made that mask? Because I created that layer with the selection, it's automatically going to put the mask on there. And what that does now is when I make an adjustment to the exposure up here in the upper right, I'm only going to affect the sky. And what I like to do is I like to really dial down that sky. And I don't want to go so much that I lose my clouds that I worked on, but I want to darken it. I want that to be really dark and let that building pop. I can still see my clouds here subtly, but they're there, and there's some implied motion, implied long exposure. So that's what we're doing with the sky exposure layer. So I'm going to delete that layer we just made. One of the last steps for me, once I have this all looking the way I want it, I'm going to go in and make smaller adjustments here. So when I shot this, I really liked the air conditioners, and I really wanted to kind of pull some attention back to them. So I created a dodge and burn layer. If you don't know what dodging and burning is, essentially it's using a brush to make some areas of the photo a little bit darker and others a little bit lighter. Dodging is making things lighter, burning is making things darker. And if you're curious about this specific technique, you're looking for dodging and burning on a 50% gray layer. In my case, I wanted to draw attention back to the air conditioners. So the easiest way for me to do that was to burn in these shadows. And I'm going to turn that on. I've burned in a little bit of the shadows around the upper windows and down the sides of these verticals too. But primarily what I focused on were all the little shadows underneath the air conditioners. I'm going to turn this layer on here real quick and you'll see. It's a very, very subtle adjustment, but it adds some drama and some depth and some texture to the photo. And it makes it, to me, it really kind of makes a big difference. It's a real subtle change, but a big difference. The last thing I do on my images is I add a sharpening layer. So I create a layer of all the visible layers, and I do my sharpening on that. There's lots of different ways to do sharpening. This isn't necessarily the right way. It's not the wrong way. It's not the only way. This is just the way I typically sharpen my images. I create that layer out of all the visible layers, and I use smart sharpening. Smart sharpening works for me almost all the time with this type of image. Occasionally, I'll do something a little more localized where I'll apply an unsharp mask to the image and I'll kind of brush in and out on a mask where I want the sharpening and where I don't. Sometimes I'll use a camera raw sharpening filter, but in most cases, I'm just going to use smart sharpening on the entire image and I'm going to get the result I want. So if you have any questions about how this went together, any of the specific steps, please ask them in the comments. I'm definitely happy to talk about any part of the process. If you want a more in-depth explanation in any part of the process, let me know. I can make a video for that too. You can find me on Instagram at Chris4Media or right here on my channel. Hopefully I'll see you on my next video.